the author of the words to the hymn that I know, but I had another name to give you, and you would know what it was. Carmina Gay just played so beautifully. It was in the 1800s that the hymn was written, and It Is Well With My Soul. His wife and children had taken a ship to Europe, and he was to join them. I think he lived in Ohio. And the ship went down, and his whole family drowned. And so he wrote the words, when sorrows like sea billows roll, it is well with my soul. And I think there are sorrows like sea billows rolling around. And so I just thank you, Carmina, for playing that so well, so beautifully. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech, in which he said memorably many things. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, and he meant women too, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I read these words about 2:30 this morning when I awakened with one line of a song I just couldn't place. I knew the song, knew it well. And it turns out it was a protest song from the 60s. I think it was written in the 50s. And the line singing in my mind was, when will they ever learn? When will they ever learn?
Where have all the flowers gone?
And it doesn't have to be a war protest song, does it? For those lines to have meaning today. When will we ever learn? When will we ever learn? The Civil Rights Act of 1963 addressed but did not end the inequities of racism. The specter of inequities yet to come had not fully shown its face, that of unchecked capitalism. We are living in real time what that is doing to the soul of America. The unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are threatened as they have not been. Thomas Merton, the 20th century mystic monk, wrote, I've come to think that care of the soul requires a high degree of resistance to the culture around us, simply because that culture is dedicated to values that have no concern for the soul. Before this present crisis, for which I cannot predict an end in my lifetime, since the turn of the 21st century, just 25 years ago, the U.S. has had 3 come-to-Jesus moments that I'll identify as opportunities to change the course we are taking into very rough seas where sorrows will roll and roll and roll. Most of you remember these three come to Jesus moments, though they may not have been given that name universally. On September 11th, 2001, we were shocked by surprise attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, New York, and Washington. Over 3,000 people were killed. That the planes were crashed into buildings where commerce and war were planned and executed to some degree was no accident. For those are two acknowledged markers of who America is. Though many of us are reluctant to admit that it isn't something to be proud of, that commerce and war are two of our hallmarks. After the attacks, things went quiet for a few days. I remember television commercials were not played. At least some were not played. I mean, it was quiet. And then things settled down a little bit. We were told to shop, remember? And then we went to war. And then things settled down. We didn't think we had a lesson to learn. We thought that those people, they were going to learn a lesson, by George. It was George, wasn't it? George Bush II. Nearly 20 years later, in the spring of 2020, the deadly COVID virus made a surprise attack on Americans, making some very sick, and others feel as though they had a mild case of the flu. Chaos resulted from inconsistent directives and unverifiable blame surrounding the origins and effects of the virus and the possible cures of it. And we saw what seemed to have been a fairly decent protection of our health and well-being in this country shown to have rips and holes the size of Texas. And more than 1 million Americans died. But those of us who wore them for a little while put away our masks and went back to brick and mortar stores, and things seemed to settle down a little bit. Some of us dared to say, though, no, we won't go back. Sonia Taylor wrote these words at the time, we won't go back to normal. Normal never was. We normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depleting, extraction. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all humanity and nature. But most of us just shook our heads and returned to normal. On January 6th, 2021, a mob attacked the U.S. Capitol. In the hours following the attack, many were injured, some were killed. And what had seemed like sacred ground in this country was defiled. There were sort of swift consequences for some of the perpetrators, who were jailed with sentences of varying length, some in months and others in many years. And because President Biden told us that we need to remember that this is not who America is, we accepted that because it was more comforting than the truth. And things settled down. And then, after you blinked your eyes about 3 times, January 20th, 2025 happened. With the threat of oligarchy not just looming, which is the word I wrote, but almost visible right now. After the attack of the Capitol 4 years earlier, I hadn't settled down. I was forced in 2024 to take time to reflect on my 80 years of naivete, and came to see that maybe I had had mistaken conclusions about the breadth and depth of God's dream, and how, in fact, God's wishes for humankind and all of creation frequently sound a lot like Judith's wishes for all of creation and all of humanity. I've been pretty clear in my 30 years with you all, a little more than that, with some of you all. I've been really clear that I question whether capitalism and Christianity can coexist. And I have agreed to say I think they have little to do with each other. Or rather, I'm not sure today either capitalism or Christianity, as it is being writ large in the world, has much to do with Jesus' teachings. So maybe that's one thing they have in common. Let me find where I was. I've failed to remember that it is my own interpretation of Jesus' teachings and my interpretation of some theologians and Bible scholars whom I happen to admire that I have come to this way of understanding what our soul in America really could look like. I've made the mistake of assuming others who have good sense would agree with me that Christianity and capitalism are not comfortable bedfellows, and that we should find a way for all Americans to make a life while they're also making a living. And that the CEOs and CFOs and all the other O's and C's and elected officials would see it my way if only I could get them to listen to me. Confessing my comeuppance in front of some of you who have known me the full nearly 30 years and others who've known me a good part of that time can keep me humble, which is one of the things we're supposed to be, I guess. But I truly have had to rethink my way of understanding what Jesus, in his various speakings and preachings that are in the Gospels, what he was trying to say, not to me, not to everybody, but maybe to me. Maybe Jesus wasn't speaking to all of us corporately, but maybe Jesus was speaking to each of us individually, making it imperative that I think what I can do, not what we can do necessarily. We can't do corporately what we don't do or won't do individually. Jesus said you can't love both God and mammon or wealth. And I want to say that's not fair. I like what capitalism has done for me. But here's the rub. I also am awake to the inequities and inequalities this economic system demands. And here's a verse that you all will remember, some of you. Micah 6:8 asks, "And what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God?" I've read it 47,612 times just since 2:30 this morning, and I have not seen it in it that there's even one mention of a super yacht or $1 billion or having free delivery by tomorrow at 3 p.m. Do justly, love kindness, walk humbly with God. I speak from the privilege of being single and living alone, providing only for myself. I don't think it's easier for me to stop shopping frivolously and having DoorDash deliver my food rather than cooking, but it's simpler than if I had a family. And of course, even I have to decide if breaking up with Jeff Bezos and the Goodwill stores in Forsyth County is what will help me, as Thomas Merton writes, resist the culture around me. Merton wasn't the first to speak about the culture and the care of our soul. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "You cannot worship two gods at once. Loving one God, you'll end up hating the other. Adoration of one feeds contempt for the other. You can't worship God and money both." It's from the Eugene Peterson, The Message transliteration. You can't worship God and money both. But we try. We surely try. Our culture, it seems, is quite effective at resisting our resistance. Or I should say, perhaps, in light of my confession, our culture is quite effective at resisting my resistance. I'm fine. Yeah, as long as I can hold that.